Greetings and welcome back for another Music Theory Bite. In this video, I'm going to be talking about suspensions. If that sounds like something you'd like to learn more about, then this is the video for you. A suspension is a non-chord tone that is approached by common tone and left by step down. That definition has a couple of parts that I think need a little bit of explanation. So first, a suspension is a non-chord tone. That means that the note that is being suspended isn't a part of the harmony that's being sounded at the time that is acting as a suspension. That seems easy enough, that it's not a part of the chord that supports it. Next, it is approached by common tone. That means in order to get into the suspension, the note had to have been sounded in the previous chord, which means that it must have been a part of the previous chord. And finally, left by step down. That is, we have this dissonant note, a note that's not part of the chord, and in order to make it consonant again, it will descend by step to become a member of the chord that is currently supporting it. So those are the requirements that we have to have in order to have a suspension. So we could also say that a suspension has three parts: a consonant preparation, the place where the note that will be suspended is a part of the chord that precedes the suspension, the dissonant suspension, that is when the chord changes, the note that becomes the suspension doesn't change. In fact, we can think of a suspension as basically being a note that doesn't change into the next chord along with all of the other notes that do change. It's delayed for some reason. And finally, it has a consonant resolution. That is, the suspended note is dissonant and it becomes a consonance when it steps down to become a member of the chord that's supporting. So let's see how this works in operation. So let's start with a very basic progression. We're in the key of D major, and I'm going to be moving from a subdominant, a 4 chord, to a dominant, a 5 chord. And without any non-chord tones stuck in, that sounds like this. Suspensions are created when we have a change of chords and one of the chord tones, one or more of the chord tones I should say, doesn't resolve when the other chord tones move. That is, its resolution is delayed. And I'm specifically looking for places where a chord tone steps down from one chord to the next. In this example, I see two places where I can put that. First, in the soprano voice, I have a B, which should move down to an A when the chord changes. But if I delay that motion, let all the other chord tones move to the 5 chord, but hold on to that B in the soprano just for a little while and then resolve it down, I've created a suspension. And it sounds like this. Specifically, we call that a 9/8 suspension. And you'll want to get used to labeling your suspensions this way. We label them based on the interval of the suspending note above the bass pitch. So that B is consonant above the 4 chord. It's at the third of the 4 chord. It becomes dissonant over the 5 chord, and when the bass moves from the G to an A, that B is a ninth above the A, so that's the first number of the suspension, and then it resolves down to an octave above the A, 9 going to 8. So this is a 9/8 suspension. And just to double check that I've done this the right way, every suspension has three parts. We start with a consonant preparation. The B is a member of the 4 chord that precedes the 5 chord. A dissonant suspension. It becomes a dissonance when all the other chord tones move to the 5. B is not a member of the 5 chord in this key, and so it is a dissonant suspension. And then we have the consonant resolution when it steps down to become a member of the 5 chord. It's the root, the doubled root in this particular chord. The other place I could put a suspension in this progression is in the tenor voice. because I see that it also steps down. So what I can do is I can delay the resolution of that D, which moves down to a C sharp, and that will create another suspension. And that sounds like this. That's a very common and characteristic sound. I'm sure you've heard that all over the place in music. So we would label this one as a suspension, and then we would check the interval above the bass. From A to D, we have a fourth, which resolves down to a third. So this would be a 4-3 suspension. One of the things I can do with suspensions, which is kind of cool, is combine them together. So I could do my 9/8 suspension in the soprano at the same time that I'm doing the 4-3 suspension in the tenor. And that would sound like this. Let's expand this progression just a little bit and see if there are other opportunities to put in suspensions. So simply by taking my 4 to my 5, I'm going to change it to a 5-7 this time, and then resolving it to a 1 without any non-chord tones. It sounds like this. Now looking at this example, I see several places where I could put in suspensions. I'm looking for anywhere where I have the same voice stepping down. So in the soprano, from the 4 chord to the 5 chord, I have that B stepping down to an A. I could put a suspension in there. That would be a 9/8 suspension. And then, just like in the previous example, we have the tenor voice going from a D down to a C sharp, in which case we could call that a 4-3 suspension. We can also elaborate from the 5-7 to the 1 because we have one note in there, the G, moving down to the F sharp, which is also a descending step. So in this case, I could suspend that G by a beat, which will create another 9/8 suspension, G moving down to F sharp. And that sounds like this. One other interesting thing about this. Oftentimes we think of dominant seventh chords as being their own thing, but dominant sevenths actually arose out of non-chord tones being stuck onto basic triads. So if we take a look at our original example, we see that the G in the alto voice gets held over when the 4 chord moves to the 5 chord, essentially creating a 7 above our chord root. That originally was a suspension, a non-chord tone. We have the consonant G in the 4 chord, which moves to the dissonant G, or stays on the G to become a dissonance on the 5 chord, and when it resolves down by step, as all good suspensions do, the bass has already changed to resolve to the 1 chord. So, like many non-chord tones, it actually, if it's used enough and in the same way, can create a whole new harmonic structure, which is, in a way, kind of cool. So what you'll find is when you work on suspensions that the same numbers keep coming back again and again. And in fact, there are only a limited number of legal suspension figures. If you're writing a suspension and you don't come up with one of these combinations of numbers when describing your suspension, then you've made a mistake. You need to go back and double check it. So for example, the legal suspension figures, we've already seen this one a couple of times, a 9/8, which is the ninth, resolving down to an octave, a 7/6, a seventh, resolving down to a sixth above the bass, a 6/5, which is called the consonant suspension because a sixth is not really dissonant, and it resolves also to a consonant fifth. That one's kind of rare, but it does show up on occasion. We've seen the 4/3 suspension, and then as a counterpart to the 9/8 suspension, if you don't have the voices spread out by an octave, we could have a 2/1 suspension, that is a second resolving to a unison. Finally, we have what's called the bass suspension, which is a 2/3 suspension. All the other ones, you'll notice, have two numbers that step down, 9 to 8, 7, 6, 6, 5. This one goes the opposite direction, 2 to 3. So what's going on here? Well, remember that we measure suspensions from the bass pitch. So when the voice resolves and the bass stays the same, that means that your first number is going to step down to a lower number. 9 will step down to 8. 4 will step down to 3. But when it's the bass pitch that is being suspended, that means that the interval between the bass and the other consonant tones is going to be expanding because it's the bass itself which steps down. So a 2-3 suspension is a suspension that is occurring in the bass voice. It's a second below one of the other voices, which will move to a third below one of the other voices. So let's check this out. How does this actually work? Let's start with a new progression. So in this case, I'm going to go from a 1 to a 2-6 to a 5-4-3 back to a 1. And that sounds like this. Looking through that progression, I have several opportunities to put suspensions. I'm looking for anywhere where I have a step down in the texture. So taking a quick look at this, I see that from the first chord to the second chord, I have two opportunities there. In the alto voice, my F sharp will step down to an E, and that will create a 7-6 suspension. And that sounds like this. So that's a fairly common example of a 7-6 suspension. Also, in the first chord to the second chord, the 1 chord to the 2-6 chord, I see that my tenor voice steps down from the A to the G. Another opportunity to put in a suspension. So in this case, if I hold over the resolution of that tenor voice and to delay it just a little bit, I'm going to end up with a 2-1 suspension. My second above the bass pitch will come down to a unison with the bass pitch. Leaving in my 7-6 suspension in the alto, because I can do that, I'm going to have two suspensions going simultaneously. And that sounds like this. We've also talked about the bass suspension, and sure enough, in the bass voice, I do have one place where it steps down, and that is from the 5-4-3 chord, the second last chord, to the tonic chord that ends the example. If I were to delay the resolution of that bass voice, then I can create a suspension, a bass suspension, and it will form a second with the tenor voice, because the tenor voice goes ahead and resolves to its note in the 1 chord. And then by delaying that resolution, it steps down to become a 2-3 suspension, a third below the tenor voice. So all the suspensions in it together sound like this. So let's summarize. A suspension is a particular type of non-chord tone that is approached by common tone and left by step down. All suspensions have three components: a consonant preparation, where the note that gets suspended is a member of the chord that precedes the chord where it's a non-chord tone; the dissonant suspension, where the note gets held over as if it's waiting to resolve to where it needs to go; and finally the consonant preparation, where the dissonant note steps down to once again be a member of the chord that supports it. There are only a couple of legal suspension figures, and we measure these figures based on the distance above the bass pitch. We have 9-8 suspensions, 7-6 suspensions, 6-5 suspensions, the consonant suspension, 4-3 suspensions, 2-1 suspensions, and when the suspension happens in the bass, it's a 2-3 suspension. You can add suspensions into any part writing exercise wherever you see stepwise motion down between two chords. Well, that does it for this video. If you found it helpful, please make sure you like it. Feel free to subscribe to my channel for the latest music theory bites as they become available, and as always, you can leave some constructive criticism below. Until next time,